guys. All right, so it's time to get started on our 7th session on the book of Judges. And of course, my phone has to ring as soon as I start. We'll let the answer machine pick that up. So if you're calling and you're watching this, I'll get your message when the session is done. Yeah, so let's see. I want to make sure that things are working here today and make sure that everybody can hear me and that the live post is working. And I'm checking, looking to see. It says that I am here and I am live. So, okay, as long as y'all can hear me, I think we're doing good. All right, so in the period between Jair and Jephthah, we see a change in Israel's rebellion against God. Not only do they allow the worship of other gods to creep into their way of life, they completely turn their backs on it. It's easy to look at Israel's roller coaster faith and judge them. But how do we do this in our relationship with Jesus? So Jephthah was an interesting case. Though he was a great warrior, he came from a rather unflattering family. He was a cast-off. He was rejected by that family. He led a band of worthless rebels. He surrounded himself with these men of ill repute. And at the start, Jephthah's motivation for leading God's people is selfish. He wasn't mentioned as specifically being chosen by God. So what changes? And how and why does God use Jephthah? And so that's what we're going to learn about today. Have you ever started out with the intention of doing something good, only to have it end up causing a problem instead? Maybe you thought you were helping someone, but instead you accidentally triggered an unintentional consequence. Sometimes misguided good intentions are outweighed by negative consequences. There's a wonderful quote by an unknown author that poignantly sums this idea up. It says, "Remember, people will judge you by your actions, not by your intentions. You may have a heart of gold, but so does a hard-boiled egg." You know, we've all seen news stories where there's a high-speed pursuit. They're trying to chase down a criminal, and police officer tragically struck and killed an innocent pedestrian. The officer was deemed to have been acting negligently and was held to blame. Now, the officer didn't intend to hurt anyone. He was simply acting on the good intentions of protecting civilians by taking a criminal off the streets. Unfortunately, he will be forever remembered for the unintended consequence, not the intention that led to it. Jephthah was chosen by God, following in the footsteps of his predecessors. But history doesn't remember him as kindly as Deborah or Ehud. He is the classic case of what can happen when we let our God-inspired intentions get derailed by personal ambition. After the disaster of epic proportions that was Abimelech, gosh, I can't talk. There followed two judges, Tola and Jair. We don't really know a whole lot about them, so we're just going to move forward onto that sad story of Jephthah. Once again, the story of this judge begins as all the others have before him, as we've heard throughout all of Judges. There's a slight shift in the pattern that reflects the continual degradation of Israel's character. Now, in the past, they had adopted the worship of foreign gods into their practices, essentially trying to serve two masters, both idols and gods. And at the same time, it just doesn't work. But this time, they completely abandoned God. A nation built on God's principles, existing only because he set them free, has now completely and utterly abandoned him. This is more than just a repetitive cycle. This is a downward spiral that's sending a nation deeper into sin. It's understandable to learn that God was more than a little angry over this, and the punishment was incredibly severe. The author of the book of Judges goes as far to say that the Philistines and the Ammonites shattered and crushed them. I mean, this paints a very dark and bleak picture. Still, despite the horrendous conditions that they endured, it took the Israelites 18 years to turn back to God and to cry out for help. I mean, I can't help but wonder what was going through their minds for those 18 long years. Was it pride that kept them from turning back to God? Was it spiritual blindness? You know as well as I do that sin has a way of clouding our judgment. And one of the enemy's greatest weapons is to convince us to run away from God when we get lost in our sin, when he is the very person that we need to get closest to. And the longer we run, the harder it is for us to turn back. You know, we come up with all kinds of excuses and rationalizations, but in the end, it just doesn't matter. There's only one hope, only one salvation, because there is only one God. Finally, Israel comes to her senses and turns back to God. And the Bible records their actions in a powerful verse. It's Judges 10, verse 16, where it says, "Then they got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord, and he could bear Israel's misery no longer." So, first, we see that Israel has taken an important step. They got rid of all their idols and they served the Lord. And then God could bear Israel's misery no longer. I mean, that is an incredibly powerful statement. Israel had demonstrated the utmost contempt for God's ways. They had abandoned him, choosing destruction over serving him. But God's love never wavered. Watching the suffering moved him so greatly to compassion that he could no longer bear it. This is the ultimate picture of a father running to his wayward child with open arms. Israel was staring down at near total annihilation at the hands of their old foes, the Ammonites. Their armies were prepared to wipe Israel from Canaan and just be gone. And then there came Jephthah. Now, similar to Abimelech, Jephthah was an illegitimate son. His father sinned with a prostitute, and as a result, she became pregnant. So not only was Jephthah illegitimate, but he was born to the lowest of lowly people. His half-brothers drove him away, forcing him into homelessness. Still, he managed to make a name for himself, building a reputation as a fierce warrior. Unfortunately, he surrounded himself with a bad crowd, and he ran away from his brothers and went to go live in Tob. Throughout the Bible, we see warnings about what can happen when you associate with such scoundrels. One such verse comes from Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20, where it says, "Walk with the wise and become wise. Associate with fools and get in trouble." Why do you think this verse warns about this? I mean, after all, aren't we each responsible for our own actions? Well, the simple answer is yes. But the reality is that it's easier to pull someone down than it is to pick them up. Just as gravity works against the ladder, sin acts as a weight that clings to a non-foolish person surrounded by fools. Jephthah chose to surround himself with fools, which later came back to haunt him. So war finally breaks out, and Gilead asks Jephthah to come back and lead their army. Though he was an outcast before because of his mother, Whatever he had done to earn his reputation as a great warrior was enough for them to forget about his upbringing. Jephthah may have surrounded himself with poor choices and friends, but he was no fool. And his first instinct was to attempt a diplomatic solution. In the Old Testament, this presence of the Spirit was a rare superpower that transformed normal men like Jephthah into holy warriors for God. Jephthah led his army to a tremendous victory over the Ammonites. But unfortunately, by the time that this happened, he had already made his first of two horrible, deadly mistakes. Now, we've already seen that Jephthah was more than capable of sound judgment. His dealings with the Ammonites already support this. That being said, before he marched into battle, he made a terrible mistake. He boldly and blindly declares that whatever or whomever comes out of his tent when he returns will be sacrificed. Yeah, I'm doing the same thing. What? Why on earth would he make such a ridiculous oath? There was no mention of an oath that was being required by God. There's no precedence in Israelite history for an oath of this kind. Whether he was just getting caught up in the moment or he felt he needed to make a pious sounding statement, Jephthah commits himself to an oath that has no bearing in Israelite law or tradition. God is very clear in the Old Testament and today as well that he in no way condones human sacrifice in any form. Jephthah not only left that as a possibility, but one has to wonder what exactly was he expecting to come out of his tent? I mean, unless he made a practice of storing a few goats in the place that he slept, the only real possibility was that a human being was going to be the one to leave his tent when he returned. And not just any human being, but most likely a family member. I mean, who else is going to be hanging out inside of his tent? Jephthah was not a simpleton. He, I don't know what he was thinking. What could he have possibly been thinking when he made this oath? And the worst possible scenario unfolds when he returns from the battle victorious over the Ammonites. And it is his daughter that exits the tent. Now, understandably, he is struck with grief over this occurrence. And this leads to a fascinating kind of what if scenario. Jephthah made an incredibly foolish vow before God, something no one was going to enter into lightly. This vow with God, it's an unbreakable pact, or at least it should be. And so now Jephthah is faced with this choice of breaking his vow or murdering his daughter. He chose the latter, burning her alive as if she was a sacrifice made to God. Seriously, God detested the practice of human sacrifice. And when faced with the choice of two sins, Jephthah chose the one that involved killing one of God's beloved creations. I'm sorry, but it's hard to imagine seeing that as a right choice. I mean, the simple fact is that it wasn't. But this was just the beginning of Jephthah's downfall. Under his leadership, a bloody civil war broke out, resulting in the death of over 42,000 Israelites. God's guidance and leadership were conspicuously absent from the story of Jephthah's daughter's death and the civil war that rocked Israel. The biblical account doesn't mention if the foolish scoundrels that Jephthah had surrounded himself with prior to the battle against the Ammonites were still present. But there's no denying that he had begun to make very foolish decisions. Who we surround ourselves with ultimately plays a role in who we become. God chose Jephthah despite his family's sins. One of the positives that we can take from this story is that God doesn't see us in the same light that others see us. To the people of Gilead, Jephthah was just the illegitimate son of a prostitute. But to God, he was a great warrior that would set God's people free. But on the flip side, we see a man who surrounded himself with fools. He made rash, unwise decisions despite showing the capability of doing just the opposite. Our friends shape us. This is why God tells us to be careful who we associate with. Our good intentions, even our oaths that we make to God, are meaningless if they lead us into sin. Jephthah started out with his intentions in the right place. Now history will forever remember him for the results of his actions. So where are your intentions? How will history remember you? Will you pray with me? Lord, grant us the spirit of wisdom and discernment as we stand strong in all our decisions. Remind us to put you first before all things, and let our desire be to follow your will. Help us to keep close to you in spirit, and may your word and will be our guide in every decision we make in our lives. Give us hearts of wisdom and help us to make wise choices, especially when two paths seem to be equal. And finally, Lord, help us to trust in you and obey that which is your will. And we ask this in your name. Amen. Okay, so that's it for this week. Next week will be our final session over the book of Judges, and we are going to meet Samson. I know you guys all know who Samson is. Until we can be together again, I leave you with this. Go forth now into the world, walking with the wise, not the foolhardy, trusting in the Lord to guide your path and using sound judgment in your decision making. Amen. Bye, guys. See you next week.